and welcome back to Simple Time Studios. We will be continuing Psion's adventures in Ecumenopolis of Mystery, Part 7. Psion continues to explore the ruins underneath the massive city park of the mysterious Ecumenopolis. What will he find? Let's find out. The following day, Psion woke with a groan as he rose to his feet. That was always one part of field research he never really liked. Camping out in the field was never quite as restful as sleeping in your own bed, no matter the circumstances. Still, compared to some of his other conditions, sleeping on an ancient sofa abandoned by its original users was still fairly comfortable. Certainly comfortable enough that he could reflect on what he had learned so far and how he could improve, as well as where he could go now that he was back in his camp on the surface. There was still so much of the park's surface to explore and two promising directions to explore in the tunnels below. There was also the creature or creatures down in the aquifer on the second floor. So far he hadn't seen the creature, but he had seen evidence that something was down there. He pulled out his pocket computer and referenced the creatures that had been observed so far. Maybe someone else had observed something similar. Okay. Has anyone else observed an underground amphibian and logged it into the base database? I think it's unlikely, but out of 10, the Oracle die disagrees, so apparently someone did. Is this entry particularly well detailed? I find that very unlikely. And at a 96 on the Oracle die, yeah, it's a short paragraph at best. Psion raised an eyebrow when he saw his query had gotten a response. Turns out someone had seen something similar and reported a vaguely humanoid amphibian living in the flooded parts of the underground. But unfortunately, that was pretty much it. There wasn't any information on whether or not the creature was an herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore, or how aggressive it was. The idea of being the first to find out more about this largely unknown creature was exciting but also terrifying. Still, he was making more progress surveying the underground than he was on the surface, and there were more interesting plant and animal samples undiscovered underground than there were currently above it. The decision made, he got ready to go back down in the tunnels and began his descent. Level 1, down the stairs again to level 2. Had not even a dozen steps and he was on the catwalk just above the overgrown aquifer again. Is the creature awake or asleep? I give it a 50-50. I give it a 50-50 and 95 says no. So Psion is free to pass as long as he doesn't disturb the water. The algae-choked waters were still as Psion looked through the room and made his way around the aquifer. His solar lamp continued to light the way as he ambled along and retraced his steps towards the closed bulkhead. He looked at the control console in front of it. Broken, of course. The machinery was so old he was surprised it hadn't corroded into nothingness, especially given the higher than normal humidity in this part of the tunnels. But it didn't look like anything he couldn't coax back to life. Okay. Psion attempts a mechanics check to get the control mechanism working again. He has a 1d20 plus 5 and gets an 11. Well, he gets it open at least. I think for a minor complication that it's now stuck that way. Pulling out his pocket multi-tool and fiddling with the circuits behind the controls, Psion accidentally jolted the controls to life with an electrical spark. While not injuring himself and getting the bulkhead doors open enough that he could squeeze through, he quickly saw that he burnt out several key circuits in the process, meaning the door was now stuck open unless he replaced those parts. Oh, wonderful. I hope there's nothing on the other side that needed to be kept out, Psion mused before walking forward into the new section with a hesitant step. On the other side of the bulkhead door was a small chamber barely wider than the massive 10-foot wide blast door. 3 doors, each leading in a different direction. Otherwise, the room was empty but had signs that something was in it at one point in time. Looking down at the concrete floor, he saw the tracks of something heavy making deep gouges in the otherwise smooth floor. Unfortunately, there weren't any further traces that could tell him who made those marks. Was it another machine or a biological creature he hadn't encountered yet? Okay, are all three doors unlocked? I'm not sure how likely it is, so I give it a 50-50. And 69 says no. I'm going to roll a d6. And on a 1, the one to his right, north on the map, is locked. Looking ahead, he saw a bulky mechanical lock holding the door to his right shut, and the other two were unlocked. Stepping forward into the room, he decided to open the door directly ahead of him. Beyond the door was a rectangular room with the only other doorway on the other side of the room from Psion's entrance. Old, broken server racks that were slowly crumbling into scrap metal obscured part of his view. But Psion could still smell something in the room just out of sight. Okay, I rolled for a monster and treasure in this room. Have not rolled for either yet. Has the monster spotted him? I give it a 50-50. And 18 says yes, it does know he's here. Actually, it doesn't matter since the Book of Lost Tables says it's a fairy mold. Treasure is 200 platinum pieces or the equivalent. So I'm going to rule that it's a dangerous alien mold that is scientifically interesting and guarding some barely functional server drives that might divulge further information about the dungeon or yield some usable components. Cautiously stepping forward and moving around the wrecked server racks, the stout Ursan explorer soon found the source of the smell. A reddish-brown mold that covered a large swath of the floor and wall. The life form resembled a fluffy carpet that seemed to vibrate and pulsate ever so slightly as he stepped closer to it. The smell grew more pronounced and pungent, yet he couldn't quite place what it was just yet. As the smart field researcher stood as close to the mold colony as he dared, he pulled out his pocket computer and tried to scan the unknown life form to see what he could determine. Okay, Psion makes a natural sciences check to see what he can surmise of the creature between his pocket computer and his basic senses. That's a 1d20 plus 7 for a 25 in total. So yeah, he assesses everything he can about this alien mold, including that it's flammable and mildly corrosive to the touch. The pocket computer reported back its readings just as Psion started to cough. Okay, Constitution saving throw, 1d20 plus 4 for 21 in total. His throat starting to burn, Novastar quickly ambled out of the room and backtracked to the previous chamber. Coughing violently, he cleared his throat and began to breathe normally as he reviewed his scan readings on his smart goggle display. Yes, exactly what he thought it was. The mold was secreting a gas that was flammable and toxic to life forms, evolved in a normal oxygen and nitrogen mix. There were also trace vapors of a corrosive base compound in the air. Not enough to be a threat on its own, but it had to come from somewhere, and there was only one visible source of chemicals in the room. Safely back in the previous room, the stout explorer considered his options. There was an easy if dangerous solution. He had several things that could easily ignite the mold. But of course, starting a fire this deep underground was not without risk. And it would also likely destroy any hope of getting a sample for later analysis. Perhaps there was something he could use instead. Alright, Psion is going to spend a genius point to use his plan, what if we used this? Now I just need to figure out a reasonable alternative to setting the mold on fire. Now that I think about it, there are several sources of chemicals behind him that he could use to make a mold killer. Probably stretching the definition of the plan a bit, but still. Backtracking to the chemical storage tank room and searching around, Psion found some gummy residue. A quick scan with his pocket computer revealed that the chemical composition was exactly what he was looking for. Making sure his gloves were firmly on, he rolled up a small, bouncy ball of the residue, then headed back into the moldy server room. Avoiding breathing too deeply as he stepped into the room, Psion gently tossed the ball in the middle of the mold carpet. For a second there was nothing. Then the gooey ball melted a hole in the middle of the mold colony. Then the hole grew and grew and grew. An acidic burning smell wafted up from the floor and stung his nostrils, forcing Psion back again. But it did accomplish what he needed. When he dared enter the room again, the carpet-like mold colony had disintegrated to a few scraps that could be easily scraped into a specimen container. The concrete floor was visible again. He could see if any of the computer equipment survived with its data intact, and all it cost him was that he was going to need to give his gloves a serious cleaning later. After collecting and sealing away samples of the mold colony, Psion ambled towards a wiry metal rack supporting silicon crystal data storage units. Mold had started to cover and corrode some of the contacts, but perhaps there was still something here. Alright, is there any data on these devices, or is it all e-waste scrap? I have to say it's unlikely given the conditions down here. And 13 is still 40 or less, so yes, Psion can connect with some of the data units and download some data with his pocket computer. Is it useful data, though? I think it's very unlikely that Psion should be that lucky. And 9 says yes, he is. I swear I am rolling these oracle dice fairly. Some of the electrical contacts were corroded beyond repair by mold and moisture, but a few crystalline databases looked intact enough. Psion pulled out his pocket computer and started to scan the contents. Alright, Psion is going to make a computer's check to download and translate the server data into something his pocket computer can understand. It's a 1d20 plus 7, and he gets a 9. Unfortunately, poorly maintained equipment and the challenge of translating the data from one computer language to another led to a bit of data corruption, but Psion managed to recover a bit of interesting data. Most of it was environmental and botanical data about the park above him, data that would be fascinating to review and likely contribute a great deal to research of the planet's ecosystem, but it wasn't immediately useful. Of more use to him right now was the mapping data he also managed to pull out of the aging database. It wasn't much, mostly of the surface around the maintenance hut where he made his camp. What little he got of the tunnels below only reinforced just how massive this complex was without showing him too much of note. Several of the rooms ahead had a concerning number of what looked like warning symbols on them. Speaking of which, does Psion have any long-term effects from exposure to the mold? I'm going to give it a 50-50. And 10 says yes. Is it harmful? 50-50 again. And 93 says no. He's going to make a medicine skill check. 1d20 plus 7 to run a medical scan on himself with his pocket computer. Psion gets a 12 on his skill check, so he does succeed. Barely. Psion pulled out his pocket computer and ran a quick medical scan. Yes, he was infected by the mold. And while the scan didn't produce enough information to determine what the long-term effects were, it wasn't immediately dangerous to his health. Perhaps that was something he could figure out later once he analyzed the samples he collected. Even still, he was exposed, and the only decontamination equipment he knew about was on his ship or back at the main research camp. Like it or not, he needed to head back soon. Shaking his head, he looked at the map revealed by his download. There were a few interesting directions he could explore, and it looked like several areas eventually looped back to the bulkhead. The hazard symbols, if that's what they were worrying. Was it a larger mold infestation? If so, he might have to explore another part of the compound or head back entirely. He got lucky that he was able to scrape together the chemicals to form a mold killer, much less in a large enough amount to be effective. With nothing else in the server room, he opened the door on the far end of the room and went through. As the map stated, there was a small hallway with a four-way intersection in the middle. Walking down the hallway, he turned right at the intersection and headed up towards the door at the far end. Opening the door, Psion looked into a small square room, roughly 20 feet to his side, with only one other door on the wall to his right. Something seemed off about this room, though. Okay, I rolled a trap for this room. I rolled for spears shooting out of the wall. They are not poisonous. Psion is going to attempt a perception check to detect the trap. He gets a 9. Okay, he sees the trigger mechanism, but not before setting off the trap anyway. We're going to use the stats for the shell trap and everyday heroes since it's the closest comparable. I roll 2d6 damage for 7 points of damage. He has 13 HP left. Yeah, he's definitely turning back after this. Stepping in deeper, he noticed a wrecked machine a second too late. His lime green boot brushed up against the wreckage just a little too hard. What the machine was once for, he couldn't tell. Time and entropy had turned it into a precarious perched mess of jagged metal that came down with a deafening clang. Most of the metal narrowly missed him, but one particularly sharp piece managed to cut downward into his thigh. His flesh stung as the metal scrap found its mark before clattering onto the floor. Wincing, he stepped back out of the room and sat himself down on the cold concrete floor of the hallway before pulling his med kit out of his jumpsuit's cavernous pockets and began treating his injury. He quietly recited the aid instructions to focus through the sharp pain. First, a disinfectant spray. If it stings, then that means it's working. Once that stops stinging, apply the sealant cream to the wound. That will be absorbed and hardened into a protective bandage that will flake off once the wound heals. Once the smart fabric sensed that there were no foreign contaminants, his jumpsuit would sew itself back together. The whole process would take about an hour. Plenty of time to catch his breath with a short rest. Okay, Psion is going to make a medicine roll to treat his injuries. According to the core rules, he needs to beat a DC 10 and gets a 13. So he stabilizes the wound and gets a free reroll on one of his hit dice. He also takes a short rest to recover up to 3 hit dice of damage and recover 1 genius point because of his class ability. I burned 2 of his 3 hit dice and the reroll to heal completely back to max health because I'm bad at math and forgot he only lost 7 hit points. So he is topped off, but on the next short rest I can only recover 1 hit die, and I will not be able to recover a genius point from my class abilities. Psion will need to sleep for at least 8 hours to recover that. And at that point, I'm definitely turning back. Once the treatment set and Psion finished catching his breath, he slowly climbed back to his feet and returned to the room. Perhaps there was some clue what this machinery was originally used for. Okay, is there anything else of interest anything else in this room of interest? I give it a 50-50. 32 says yes. Is it related to the machine? Again, 50-50. 33 says yes. Last question. Does it relate to Psion's current goal to find some clue where there might be a seed vault or a sealed arboretum? I say that's very unlikely. And 28 says no, there is nothing here related to his search. Back inside and carefully pushing past the pile of scrap metal, Psion stepped into the room and looked again. Most of the room was filled with the metallic remains of the ruined machine that nearly fell on him. Try as he might, he could not figure out what the machine was once used for. All that was left was a massive pile of scrap for a constructor or a reclaimer to break down into something new. There was a control terminal that was still active and projected an error message in the builder's language. Psion couldn't read the alien language, but judging by the controls, including the presence of a large keyboard and a beefy control stick, the field researcher suspected the machine once serviced the robots he had encountered so far, or something else that required fine manual control. Whatever it was, it needed the entire room to function, judging by how much space the machinery took up. With nothing else he could observe, he headed towards the door on his left. Beyond the door was a long corridor that ended with another door at the far end. If Psion was right, this would loop back around, where he began to search this section of the complex. Ambling down the hallway underneath the flickering glow of weathered light-emitting diodes and the hiss of bulky metal pipes, he approached the door. Opening the door, Psion cautiously walked in. The room appeared empty, but something appeared off, and then he looked up. The entire room was at the bottom of a shaft for a massive cargo lift, and judging by the length of the ceiling, as the Commonwealth explorer adjusted his solar lamp, it went all the way up to the surface. Or at least it should. It certainly went up high enough. Seeing nothing else in the room, he continued toward the door on the other wall. As he started to open the door, a control panel on the wall caught his eye. On a whim, he pulled out his pocket computer and attempted to scan it. Okay. Psion is going to make a mechanics skill check to scan the control panel and see if the elevator is still working. Okay. 1d20 plus 5 gives me a 10. Well, at least he doesn't accidentally trip the timer this lift is supposed to be on. The scan came back almost immediately. The control panel operated the elevator and had been left on a timer to go up every 5 hours. According to his scan, he still had 3 hours left on this cycle. Unfortunately, his scan also reported an error in the system. The door mechanism to the surface was broken shut. If he had been caught on this elevator as it went upward, Psion Novastar shook his head and opened the door. He was not surprised to find an empty hallway leading back to the bulkhead foyer. He ambled down the hallway, unlocked the door from the other side, and headed into the foyer. Once again he had a decision to make: keep exploring or head back. And as much as it pained him, he had to head back and get himself scanned to make sure there wasn't any problems from that mold exposure. Who knew what it could do to him over a longer period of time? And he needed to take it back to his camp to analyze it and review the data he recovered from that server room anyway. Shaking his head, he began to trek back to his camp on the surface. Weaving his way through the corridors and equipment rooms, past the aquifer, up through the equipment garage, before finally back in the little groundskeeper's hut he had been working out of for the past day or so. After he washed his gloves to get the chemical residue off, it was the same routine. Transmit a report back to the base camp of what he had found while he prepared the mold samples for analysis. Once the samples were prepared, he ran them through his equipment. Okay, going to make a natural sciences check to see what Psion can determine about the mold. And a 1d20 plus 7 gets a 13. Once the analysis was complete, Psion reviewed the initial findings on his smart goggles before transmitting them back to base camp as an addendum. A lot of the results confirmed what he had already observed. The mold spread by spores and produced a flammable gas, and the spores appeared to be heat resistant. Did the mold colony spread by spontaneous combustion, or was this merely an immunity to its own defense mechanism? Looks like a chemical reaction was the best way to destroy it with what he had available after all. Unfortunately, what happened when the spores entered another organism was something that still eluded the Ursan explorer. Fortunately, removing it from his body shouldn't be hard once he got back to the spaceport. He packed up his equipment and got ready to leave. Backtracking the way he came through the park, he was soon back in the city. Skyscrapers once again towered over him, blotting out the sun and suspending the day in a weird perpetual sense of twilight, sustained by flickering streetlights that probably shouldn't be functional for how long they had been working since their creators disappeared. Psion continued to trek along back to the tram station. Time to see if there was another vacuum train bringing expeditions out this way. Okay, is there a train heading back to the spaceport currently at the park station? I think it might be unlikely that it would be that simple. And 92 says no. Psion is taking the long way back. Descending the stairs down below the surface, the returning explorer found the station empty. Not a sound beyond the buzzing of flickering lights could be heard. The terminal that displayed departure times was naturally inert, since there was no standardized train schedule anymore. Either wait and hope the spaceport sent another train down this way, call and see if they could send something, or just walk back along the route he was originally given when he first arrived on this planet. Psion knew those were his three choices. The first was impractical, and the second, well, the Sol Federation base might still owe him a favor for his help with Programmer Chen, but he wasn't sure he wanted to bother them with something so trivial. That left the third option. Returning to the surface, the smart field scientist brought up the old waypoint map he used during his first days on this planet and charted a waypoint back to the spaceport. First was the Replicator Mall, then was the old residential block he visited on his first day planetside. Each location had roughly a day's standard of travel on foot between them. With his goal and destination set, Psion put one heavy green boot in front of the other and started walking. A small land vehicle was definitely going to have to be one of the insatiable curiosity's next upgrades, especially if he ever came back to this planet. But until then, he still had two perfectly good feet. End of session.